Wow, it's a full house. This is so exciting. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. It's really a pleasure to be here. Many, many thanks to Dagmar Painter for exhibiting our show. It's such an honor, and many thanks to Zaina Azam, the head of the Jerusalem Fund, for hosting us tonight. This is a great privilege. Let's see, can I put my water here? I just wanted to begin by giving a bit of background about the family and the project to help contextualize it, so that if you do get a chance to go out and see it again, you'll have a better sense of the meaning and sort of the resonance of these paintings and the archival material in the display cases and the 2 videos that are out there. But first, just a little bit of background about the family before talking more broadly about the meaning of this show and what it's trying to say. These multimedia images that you see out front and the archives represent the engagement of one American family in the Middle East continuously for 5 generations since 1848. And it all began with Frederic Williams and Sarah Pond from upstate New York, who, like a growing number of Americans in the 1830s and 40s, caught the bug. They were caught up in the Second Great Awakening, which was a religious revival movement that gave birth to America's first missionary movement. And the Williams family produced 2 missionary sons. One son went to China, and our ancestor, Frederic Williams, ended up in Mosul, the city now occupied by ISIS. Their goal was to save souls, as they put it, and saving souls in those days meant converting Christians to Protestantism. It was illegal to proselytize Muslims in the Ottoman Empire at that time. Let me just show you Frederic. This is Frederic about 10 years later. This is him with his second wife, because his first wife died in Mosul after 5 years. And Frederic toiled on, enduring disease and hardship and the death of 2 more wives, frankly, with very little to show for it. His one Protestant pastor that they converted in Mosul was chased out of Mosul by the other Christian clerics, who were rather threatened by his attempt to poach their congregants. And he himself is buried in Mardin, Turkey, where he ended up. The second generation, actually you'll see her here, the second generation, this is Cornelia. She grew up in Mosul and moved back to the States to attend Mount Holyoke College. And I think felt very alienated in this white waspy world of Massachusetts. So as soon as she graduated, she got right on back to the Ottoman Empire. She moved to Constantinople, where she met her husband, a Canadian missionary who ran girls' schools, largely for Armenians, many of whom had converted to Protestantism. And this is the picture. You see it in the hallway. Now, they ended up living and working in Adana today in western Turkey near the coast, where in 1909 massacres of the Armenian community took place. There were about 10 to 20,000 Armenians massacred, and they ultimately ended up saving lives, not souls, when they sheltered hundreds of Armenian families in their compound in Adana. And I forgot to show this picture, but this is a picture of a kindergarten that they ran for young girls in Adana. Now, the third generation of our family wanted nothing to do with religion, and they worked in education in the Middle East. Kate Chambers, who was born in Erzurum, Turkey, and grew up in Adana, also missed life abroad after getting her PhD in Islamic studies at Columbia University. And she dragged her new husband, well, not her new, her husband, her only husband, Lawrence Seelye, to Beirut in 1919. And this is actually a picture of their backyard and their house in Hamra. In fact, they built the very first house on Hamra Street. Now, Lawrence taught philosophy at AUB, and Kate taught at Beirut Women's College, which today is Lebanese American University, during what I would like to call the golden era of U.S.-Arab relations in the 20s and 30s. Yes. Our father, who is this figure up here, it's a bit blurry, grew up in Beirut, and yes, that is a camel. There was a camel in their backyard in Hamra. I know my Lebanese friends say, no, there were no camels in Beirut. It's like, no, there were camels. And he entered the Foreign Service when America was really stepping into its role as a superpower after World War II. And he saw the potential for American diplomacy to be used as a force for good in the region. And here's a picture of him, his first post in the Middle East in Jordan. But as some of the archival material indicates, I mean, you'll see some of the material in which he calls for, U.S. recognition of the PLO. He became very frustrated with U.S. policy, especially as it related to the Palestinian issue. And because he wasn't afraid to speak out and state his displeasure about this particular policy, Kissinger used to call him our PLO man in the State Department, which, as you can imagine, was not a career booster in the 1970s. Still, he did serve as ambassador to Tunisia and Syria, and here he is meeting Hafiz al-Assad in '78. Now that leads us to the fifth generation, the children of a diplomat who largely grew up in the region, and we all rejected the idea of foreign policy as a career, maybe because of our father's experience. We were a little more jaded about what American policy could do. So I lived off and on in the Middle East. My last time there, I was in Beirut for 9 years, from 2000 to 2009, working as a journalist for NPR. And now I'm at the Middle East Institute. And my sister, of course, as you've seen, draws on the region for her inspiration in her art. So that, very briefly, is the arc of the family's history. And I just wanted to go through it first. Initially, I'd wanted to use it as a lens through which to look at a broader story about the evolution of the U.S.-Arab relationship, both the personal and the official relationship. And so I began to work on a documentary which, alas, remains unfinished, but there are excerpts of it out in the hall, so I hope you can catch it. Instead, Ammanda saved me and came up with the great idea of turning all of this material, the video and the old archival material, into a multimedia installation. And so she's created this wonderful archive of images, and I've created, in addition, a short video, which I really hope you get to see, comprised of amazing Super 8 footage taken by my father for 20 years in the Middle East. It's really nostalgic. This is my mother in Jordan in 1951. And there's also some wonderful footage of Palmyra, which you must not miss. It's at the beginning of the film. And what we hope this material conveys is really the evolution of views and understanding of the region by the Americans who encountered it over the span of time, as well as the evolution of America's official sort of engagement with the Middle East. The first relations, as you saw, led by missionaries and businessmen, were problematic. Americans went out in the 30s and 40s deeply convinced that their way was best, their religion was best, and they had this sense of exceptionalism and superiority. But just 20 years later, in the 1860s, a more culturally attuned generation of missionaries realizes, if not the arrogance, at least the counterproductiveness of trying to convert people in the birthplace of religion. And they set about seeking to impart American values through education. And hence you see in 1866 the establishment of Syrian Protestant College, which later becomes AUB. And everybody will get all nostalgic, because here's a lovely picture of AUB, actually from the 1920s. And you can see how close it was to the shore. And I should note, just in terms of the evolution, that by the fifth generation, our generation, Amanda's and mine, there is no desire to spread anything American, just a desire to bring Arab voices to America through film, through conferences, through the arts, and to let them speak for themselves, knowing the power of the voices from the region. So side by side with this family evolution, there's also a change in how the Arab world views America, which is less obvious in these works, but comes across in some of the archival material which you'll find in the display cases, especially on the side. And outside is a letter written by my grandfather. Here's a picture of him in his AUB Logic class, probably early on in 1920. There's a letter written by Howard Bliss, who was the second president of AUB. And in this letter, Lorenz writes about how Bliss has just died, and the whole region is in mourning throughout Syria and up to Egypt. They are wailing in despair over the death of this American. And he was loved, not just for the AUB work that he did, but also the philanthropic work that the Americans did in World War I, providing aid during a time of great famine and suffering. And he was also linked to President Woodrow Wilson, which, you know, as many of you in this room know, called for sovereignty for Arabs, you know, after World War I, which of course they did not get. But interestingly enough, 50 years later, my father returns to Beirut after the assassination of the American ambassador Francis Malloy in 1977, and he's sent out there to oversee the evacuation of American embassy personnel because of the dangers. And the city of his very happy childhood has now become unsafe for Americans. So you see a bit the political evolution there. The show, we hope, also reflects the two-way exchange that any cultural encounter leads to. This pretty much looks like what our family room has looked like for the last 170 years. Lots and lots of Persian carpets. Americans tend to focus on how powerful the spread of their culture is, but our family was profoundly changed by their time in the region. Frederic and Sarah were deeply immersed in the Mosul community. There was no American compound to escape to. They spoke Arabic all the time. When Sarah Pond died after 5 years in Mosul, her parting words to her children in her delirium were in Arabic. She died speaking in Arabic. Her identity sort of inexorably changed by her 7 short years in the Middle East. And then, of course, her succeeding family members all caught that same bug, but a different one. Ultimately, the Middle East welcomed our American family, allowing them to make it their home for 5 generations. And that wouldn't normally be worth mentioning, except that we're talking about a part of the world, the Arab world, that has been painted here in America as inherently, inexorably, irrevocably anti-American. And I think the real power of our family's story is that it proves quite the opposite. Americans and America have earned enormous goodwill during their early encounters, and it was because of American foreign policies later that much of that goodwill was lost. Hence, both Amanda and I hope that with this show, we can all be reminded of a different, more hopeful past between these two worlds that we're all so engaged in. A past that was based on a truly meaningful exchange between a truly meaningful person-to-person exchange that led to the creation of an institution as great as the American University of Beirut, which has really brought out the best of both cultures. I think many of us here would agree. And hopefully in the process of remembering this past, we can imagine a more hopeful future. Thank you.
Well, thanks to all of you for coming this evening, and thank you, Dagmar, wherever you are, for hosting us and the show. It is such an honor to be here tonight and to share with you our stories and our art. This installation was first shown in Abu Dhabi at the International Art Fair in 2012, and then again in Kuwait about 2 years ago. But you know, this is the first time we have shown it in the States. And I think, frankly, it is even more important to show it here than it is in the Middle East. It is actually because it's a bridge. It's a bridge between two cultures. And essentially it reveals a way for Americans to see an Arab world they know little about, and for Arabs to see that there are Americans who have an enduring tie to the Middle East, enduring ties, and a continued desire to improve their relationship. Now, I was born in Amman, Jordan, and I grew up between the States and the Middle East. And this experience informed my worldview and inspired my artistic voice. Growing up, I was surrounded by Persian carpets and brass tables and trays and Islamic calligraphy and many more beautiful artifacts that my mother so skillfully acquired in the souks of the region. So, in 2008, when Kate showed me her documentary of the family, I saw the opportunity to use the archival material. My faith in the power of art compelled me to add another dimension to the telling of this fascinating history. And that is when I started creating the mixed media images that you see here tonight. My methodology is as follows. I begin each painting by enlarging the original small black and white photograph or even the old daguerreotypes on tin. And I enlarge them onto digital canvas where I then collage, I paint, I screen print on top, creating layers and layers of imagery. All the while, I am narrating personal stories about these people. Now let me briefly explain my thought process as I work by showing you an example. So we'll start with the first painting, which is the painting of my great-great-grandfather, Frederic Williams, and his wife, Sarah Pond. So here in this picture, I have superimposed several different layers on top of the original photograph, which I enlarged onto canvas. The original photograph is on tin, it's this small. And you can barely see it, but between Frederic and Sarah is an old map, a family map of Iraq from 1848 that actually we have in our archives. And on the borders, I put some found images from an old Persian miniature showing vases and pots and rugs, items that I thought that perhaps they carried with them on their journey, on their way to Iraq, and certainly items that they would have had in their home in Iraq. Finally, I painted ghostly shapes of boats all around, particularly in the front down below. Oftentimes, and this to me, by the way, symbolizes their arduous journey to Iraq. Boats do symbolize the voyage of life, of coming full circle. Overall, the image has a sense of decay and age, emphasizing a past filled with suffering, and the painting is somber, and it speaks of tremendous hardships that lie ahead for Frederic and Sarah. The last example of my methodology is this painting, which uses the photograph of an official visit by my father, Ambassador Kate Seelye, to the president of Tunisia, who was President Bourguiba at the time. In the 70s, after terrible floods ravaged Tunisia, the Sixth Fleet of the U.S. Navy provided helicopters and aid to devastated parts of the country. Again, this is a picture of many layers. First, I silkscreened the hovering image of the U.S. Embassy seal in the center, and floating near the bottom are two oil tanks found from photographs from the 1950s of Kuwait. This refers to the importance of oil, that oil played in the U.S. Middle East foreign policy. On either side of the painting, you can see what looks like crumbling walls and drips of paint, and these symbolize the Arab Spring in Tunisia in 2010 and the ensuing chaos that followed. So I think it is important to tell this story of an American family living in the Arab world for 5 generations, particularly given the current state of relations between the region and the U.S. The show is admittedly nostalgic, and while nostalgia has been in the past defined as cultural malady, it is a powerful emotion, one which can move an artist towards self-awareness and self-realization. And for me, this work has come from a deeply personal place, and it has been truly moving to work with a family history that reflects how empowering it is to embrace difference, to embrace diversity and openness of other cultures. Thank you.
I want to thank both Kate and Ammanda for an amazing exhibition and a wonderful introduction to the work. I hope you'll have a chance to go back out and have a look at it. But if anyone has any questions, I'd love to have them take some questions and perhaps answer some more specific things about their work. Does anyone have a question? Yes, just one moment.
I actually have a question for you, Dagmar. And that is, how long will this exhibit be here, and will it be here over the Christmas holidays when people will be coming in from out of town?
Yes, the exhibition is on from now until the 24th of December, with one exception. We will be having our annual souk on the 5th of December, Saturday the 5th of December, so the exhibition will come down just for that, but it'll go back up again after that. And we unfortunately closed the offices here from the afternoon of the 24th through New Year's. But before that, if people come in. And also, we are going to be open on a couple of Saturdays. The first one will be tomorrow, between the hours of 1 and 4. So if anybody wants to come back and look at the pictures in a slightly more quiet setting, you're very welcome to do that.
Thank you. That was a stunning presentation. And actually, I think it would be amazing to have this in a documentary. Have you given up completely that thought? Because I really think it would have a lot to contribute. Thank you.
Thank you, Nadia. She's trying to encourage me to finish the documentary that sat in the closet for a couple of years. I very much want to finish the documentary. I just need about $150,000. So, maybe I could do it for $100,000. So if anybody in this room is interested, it turns out it was much more expensive to make a documentary than I imagined, and I had some seed money which allowed me to shoot. And in fact, I went sort of visiting the region, looking at all the places where the family was buried, and retracing their steps. I tried to go to Mosul, which in 2006 was rather dangerous, and instead I sent a cameraman into Mosul who discovered one of the only remaining Protestant cemeteries, and he found 3 unmarked graves. And I'm wondering if one of those was Sarah's, because Sarah died there, and then Frederic's next wife died in Mosul 1 week after she arrived. So she's buried in Mosul, and then one of their children is buried in Mosul. So, I'd love to make the documentary. Documentary is such a powerful medium, and someday it will get made. Thank you, Nadia.
What about Kickstarter?
I thought about it, but...
What about Kickstarter?
Oh, do you want to...
She's asking about Kickstarter as a funding operation.
I've thought about it, but Kickstarter, here's the problem. I'm not sure. I've applied for many grants for the documentary, and I've been turned down. So I'm a little bit discouraged, and I'm not sure I could meet my goal on Kickstarter. You have to set a goal, and if you don't meet your goal, then you have to give all the money back. And as I said, I need about 100,000. So maybe I could do a Kickstarter for 10,000, and I could at least get started. But you know, I will continue to think about this, and it's not going to die. It is going to live on, but it's going to be made maybe at a time when I have time to edit it on my own. Thank you.
Kate, are there any diaries that you, I mean, and what has happened to them, and where are they?
Jane, yes. The diaries are amazing. Frederic and Sarah left behind hundreds of pages of diaries that have been collected at Amherst College. It's a huge archive. And we had an aunt, my father's sister, who was really, truly the family historian. I am a shadow of that. And she actually took the effort to transcribe many of these letters. And you've seen the letters out in the display cases. They are indecipherable. You cannot read them because they're written in this tiny, tiny, you know, cursive on very thin paper. And she actually deciphered them and typed them all up, and I have about 800 pages of notes and diaries that are quite amazing. And I turned it into actually a documentary script about that particular era. But I'd like to work with them in a book at some point. Part of the obstacle has been that they're not terribly emotional, these letters. You know, they're real Protestants, and they don't say a lot that's really exciting. What's exciting is sort of what happened to them. The fact that they went there, and, you know, Frederic's wives kept dying, and he kept going back to America to find a new wife. And, you know, then he'd bring her out and she'd die, and he had these 2 children and they needed a mother. So that's his story is what's so interesting. His diaries are less interesting, but still, they're an amazing record. And I got an email from Amherst the other day saying that Amherst and Mount Holyoke College, and these are 2 schools that produced a lot of missionaries. In fact, Frederic's 4th wife was a missionary from Mount Holyoke who on her own had gone out to the Ottoman Empire to teach at a girls' school. And he met her after the death of his 3rd wife, and it was his first real love, I think. And then he dies 5 years later. But so Mount Holyoke and Amherst are trying to get a big grant to digitize all of these archives and put them online. So we have 5 generations of archives at Amherst.
Shouldn't ask 2 questions, but I can't resist. A number of years ago, I encountered an extraordinary unpublished PhD thesis that undertook to describe the way the missionaries were viewed and the impact of their letters home on Americans. And there was much to be said. It was a perfectly fascinating thesis, but it seemed that many of these missionaries, unlike your own esteemed forebears, were rather ignorant people, looking often the women were looking for an adventure, and off they went for lack of somebody proposing marriage, and they and they wrote letters home to their families, and because there was no Facebook and there was no internet at the time, people read them. They were published in the newspaper. The personal letters were published in the local newspaper, and they were full of the most extraordinary dismissal of the people. The filthy Armenian, the cruel Turk,
Yes.
the stereotypes that maintain today. I mean, I just wondered if you all have thought about that and had any comments.
Absolutely. I mean, that first generation, was steeped in that discourse. I mean, Sarah and Frederic are no exception. There's actually some text on one of the paintings Ammanda has done that's on this wall. It shows the 2nd generation, and it looks like they're proselytizing some Kurds. And there's some text from Frederic's diary, which talks about, in very dismissive words about the local population. But I think what is interesting, that was the first generation. And the 2nd generation, which is the generation that, founded AUB, they're starting to see the region differently. They're no longer using words like, barbarian or backward. I mean, there is sort of a backwardness, but, they're not using that same language. It's a little more sensitive. It's not perfect. you know, because it was a different time, yes, as Alan has said. And I would say that it takes until maybe the fourth generation, you know, my father's generation, where he grows up in Beirut in an era denuded of religion, where he really sees, you know, the people he grows up with in Beirut as his equals. And, you know, this is why he always, always loved, you know, my mother likes to say that his face would light up on 2 occasions, and I'm, one when he would meet a blonde, or 2 when he was talking to Arabs, because he just loved, you know, his friends from, you know, Damascus and Amman and Baghdad. So that it took 4 generations to sort of strip these Americans of their, you know, very superior views of the other, and also this thing about Islam. And, you know, then we get to, you know, let's say our generation, and we hope that we're stripped of all prejudices, and I'm pretty sure I am, but, you know, and we'd like that to be the trajectory, and that's what happens when you have an encounter, an ongoing encounter. Of course, today Americans share the view that many of these earlier generations shared, but they haven't had that direct encounter. So what this speaks to is just the power of that direct encounter, generation after generation, where it finally becomes a relationship of equals, and the exchange goes both ways. You know, at this point, it's, you know, it's as much about it coming our way as it is going, you know, to the region.
Kate, thank you so much. It's absolutely wonderful to hear your story. I'm curious, you know, coming from the tradition that you come from and your connections to the region, how do you feel about what's going on today, and how optimistic are you, or are you at all, about the future of the region and also the future of U.S.-Mideast relations?
Oh, that's not a fair question at 7:30 at night, Rasha, a journalist. But, you know, I'll just say this. There is, obviously, the region is incredibly depressing to all of us right now. You know, it's going through a transition. But all regions that go through transitions experience upheaval. I mean, everything, the edifices of the past are crumbling. You know, these edifices set up in the 50s and 60s and 70s that weren't working, they're crumbling. And something new is emerging, and just as it was very, you know, violent after the French Revolution and chaotic, it's violent and chaotic now. But there are all these very positive signs that I know you and Nadia are following, you know, on the internet, all these young Arabs who are, you know, engaging in different kinds of thinking online, rejecting the old tropes, rejecting the old religious establishments, saying, you know, we are independent thinkers, we're independent writers. Syrians have said to me, you know, this civil war is devastating, but the civil war has given us something we never had before, and that is a voice. We write for the first time. And, you know, when you write, you can build a humane culture. You can build something real and with dignity and respect for others. So I think the region is going through you know, an upheaval where hopefully they'll find, you know, their voice, and young Arabs who have been raised on the internet free from, you know, government messages and government oppression will come to a place where they can create societies that are more pluralistic and more democratic. And I'm not going to say a perfect democracy, but, you know, that are more of what young Arabs are asking for. So I think we're heading in that direction. Rasha, maybe it's 50 years, inshallah.
And on that note, I think we will conclude the questioning, and please stay and go back and have a look with new eyes at the artwork, and we're delighted that you came. Good night.